Hello.
Hey,
Welcome to Flat Pack History of Sweden. This is episode 6.
yeah, Bronze Age culture, graves and stones may hide my bones. We've called this one.
Yeah, I came up with the title, so blame me.
Yeah, in general, if the title is a pun or a joke, it's always Chris who came up with it.
Yeah. But apart from the title, welcome to episode 3 that we've recorded, I think, during lockdown, London
Yeah.
lockdown.
Yeah, it's London lockdown, but luckily we can do this without having to expose ourselves to the outside world. We are in the flat that we both live in.
And we've commuted to our desks and the microphone. So that's all we've had to do.
We have, and the past has been, which is quite nice. You can
What? What's that mean?
It was my attempt
The
to
past has been. Has been what?
has been. It has
Okay.
happened. It's my attempt to be philosophical in that to research the past, you don't necessarily have to venture outside and expose yourselves to any risks of corona.
No. Okay. Well, I think we should move
Yeah, I don't think that didn't work.
move swiftly on to our Swedish phrase of the week, which is lägga lök på laxen.
Translated to English, it literally means to put onion on the salmon. It describes an act of making something that was already bad even worse. So maybe something topical right now would be to say, as if isolation because of corona wasn't bad, now my internet is down. So my internet provider is really lägga lök på laxen.
Cool. It hasn't done that, so we're safe for now. But
No, but I mean, I think the origin of it might just be that it tastes bad to put onion on salmon. Like, putting onion on salmon means that you worsen the taste of it. It's bad. So I read an old article by Mikael Reuter, who is a Finno-Swedish linguist, and he traces the root of this phrase, lägga lök på laxen, all the way back to the 16th century. So Swedish speakers have been expressing their displeasure this way for a long time. And interestingly, so has our Danish neighbor, because the same expression exists in Danish. Last time around, we looked at Bronze Age Sweden. We looked at bronze.
yeah.
That was a thing during the Bronze Age. They traded bronze. And we looked at this period through studying the Dover boat from England and the Uleburen shipwreck that was found off Turkey.
Yeah, and we saw how these boats took their place in this amazing network of trade that helped the bronze to get to Sweden and helped the Bronze Age flourish. This is all because Sweden and South Scandinavia got in on the act by trading away its lovely amber for copper and tin. They also got back some cultural habit things like shaving. Shaving was apparently brought to Sweden from Mycenaean Greece, and a lot of other social changes as well, like including people living in small villages and family clusters, and even helped violence flourish.
Yeah, we should not forget the violence. I mean, we had our first murder in the last episode, Granhammarsmannen, which we solved, or didn't solve, if that makes sense.
No, we did have CSI Bronze Age Sweden.
We did that might be something that returns in the series. Just
Yeah.
CSI
Viking,
What-
CSI Vikings or something. Yeah.
CSI whatever age we're in. It could become a recurring feature.
Or maybe we should change it to sort of Flat Pack Investigates. As a brand.
we might get an angry letter from lawyers in America.
We also touched on those Greek and European civilizations that helped Sweden to grow and how their societies really were quite different to Sweden at this time, especially the levels of the Greek civilizations and the palace cities of up to 100,000 people.
It had nothing on that in good old Sweden.
No, but we're going to continue looking at the same time period again this week, so roughly 1800 BCE to 500 BCE.
Which we'll
No.
elaborate on today. So one thing we just touched on last time, but should emphasize a little more this time, was the changing climate. At the start of the Bronze Age, and even during the various, what we'd like to call Stone Ages, the climate was comparable to that of present-day central Germany or northern France, so a bit warmer than present-day Sweden, and that helped with population growth as they weren't sort of starving or freezing to death.
Yeah, and this warmth helped provide better opportunities for farming, and for example, there were even grapes grown in Scandinavia at this time. I don't think there's any Swedish wine around today,
Oh
but
no! I should shout. My aunt and uncle grow grapes in their garden in Sweden.
okay,
It's
so
one incredibly sunny spot in their garden where they can grow like literally a grape.
well, so not enough for wine.
No, so maybe that part of their garden is still in Bronze Age Sweden. I don't know.
Maybe. So when we reach the end of this period of the Bronze Age time we're going to be talking about today, there's going to be a little bit of a minor climate change happening in the 800s and the 700s, and that made it a little bit wetter, a little bit colder, before more radical climate change began a bit later on, around the end of this episode, sort of around 650 BCE. And that brought us to what we have in Sweden today.
Oh no, that got us the damp and cold weather we have these days.
Yeah, well, it had to happen at some point.
Bummer.
Yeah. But so for this week, what we're going to focus on, I guess, as the title suggests, graves and stones. So we're going to do that. I know we're talking a lot about Stone Age graves, so this won't be a hugely long episode, he says at the start, but it's really something we should talk about because graves are one of the best links that we have to this period of the past in Sweden. This is well before any written records or anything like that, so in a way what the dead left behind in their tombs and chambers and all the crazy stuff we'll talk about today is probably the easiest thing to look at to see what the society was like.
One of the best symbols of the period are the grave mounds, and thankfully there are a lot of them. Literally thousands of these were made in southern and central Sweden, Denmark, and southern Norway between 1800 and 1100 BCE, so the start and middle parts of this period. And as always, they varied in size. They didn't do flat pack grave deliveries at the time. So the average was about 20 meters in diameter and 3 meter high. So, but there's all sort of different ranges from that. They began as graves for one person, but were then often reused over a period of hundreds of years. So like the Stone Age tombs, there could have been dozens or even hundreds of people laid to rest in one of them.
Yeah, hopefully they sort of did a bit of a tidy up, but I don't know.
Yeah.
But one thing that these graves definitely were complex, and they required considerable amount of materials to make, and they were therefore the work of a great many people building on the techniques used before. Typically, the remains of the dead and any personal items that were going to be buried with them were placed in the middle of the tomb, and they were usually put down on a specially built bed of stones and in a wood or stone coffin.
Ooh, comfy bed of stones.
No, probably not as comfortable as our modern beds. I'm probably going to guess at a no. But after they were put down on these stony beds that weren't very comfortable, a ring of stones was frequently laid around them.
Oh, it's nice.
But then the fun part comes. When they were the mound graves, the mound would have to be built. They would use stone, timber, and turf to build up these giant piles. Larger ones have been estimated using over 3,000 cubic meters of turf,
wow.
which would have had to be cut from around 17 acres of land. So again, that's huge numbers. It's amazing how much effort would have been put into these things. It's not just a quick burial organised in a few days and say, hey guys, let's go make a 3,200 cubic meters turf thing.
That's a massive effort. And because of the amount of effort involved, it has been suggested that the mounds and the graves may reflect centres of power of local chieftain families. as they developed in clusters, and some were particularly ornate. So, like most of our evidence that we've looked at so far in this podcast, the counties of Skåne and Halland in southern Sweden have the most examples, and it's not because they're the best. That might be where I'm from, but just because they're in the south, and the south was more populated.
Yeah.
Stone graves are most definitely prominent in neighboring areas as well, and all the way up to Uppland, north of Stockholm. And we mustn't forget the amazing islands of Öland and Gotland, where you can find a lot of these as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the best is at Haga near Uppsala. And this one over there is around 50 meters in diameter, 9 meters high, and had 4 people buried in it. So that was probably, people think that was a chieftain and 3 companions. One was a woman, so perhaps a wife or a loved one. Mm. And interestingly, the practice of building these huge monumental graves started to stop around the middle of our period because cremation was simpler and less intensive graves were also becoming more common. An important development is the fact that at the same time as this change, some dead were placed in graves marked by ship-shaped stone outlines.
Oh.
Yeah, so it's basically... if you think of Stonehenge, but not sort of as ornate, just sort of regular stones that were just placed in a sort of an oblong, circular shape that looked a bit like a ship from above.
These are very cool. There are over 350 of them on the island of Gotland alone. So if you ever end up on Gotland, which you should, it's a lovely place to visit. If you just go for a walk, you'll almost certainly bump into one. The graves themselves are great evidence for this period, as up until cremation becomes a big thing, the tannin of the oak coffins in some graves even preserved the clothes of the dead. So you can find really very, very well preserved clues to the past. The oldest woolen textiles still around from Scandinavia have been found from Bronze Age graves, where the coffins themselves have helped preserve what was in the graves. So, yeah, that's a really cool side effect.
Yeah, and speaking of cool graves, perhaps the coolest one is the one called the King's Grave, and it's only about an hour away from where you grew up.
Yeah, it's in a village called Kivik on the sort of southeast coast of Sweden, and I grew up quite near there. I have never, I'm ashamed to say, I've never been to the King's Grave. I think my year in school was the only year they didn't go on a class field trip there, but I've been to the village of Kivik itself many times. We have to go and visit the King's Grave next time.
Yep, and we're about to tell you all the reasons why you should visit the King's Grave if you go. The King's Grave is a grand name, and for good reason. It's a pretty grand place. It's known for its elaborate burial chamber and lots of crazy artwork inside that hints at religious connotations. The tomb and everything around it gives a great insight into how complex a society Sweden must have developed to make such a thing possible, and it really showcases the technological sophistication of Bronze Age Scandinavia.
Yeah, unfortunately, like a lot of these places, it had already been robbed when it was sort of rediscovered in the 1750s, and archaeologists only started to properly having a look at it in the 1930s. When they had excavated it in the 1930s, they did try and reconstruct the King's Grave, but they were using the knowledge they had back then in the 1930s to do so. So it's not perfect, but it's...
close enough.
Yeah. The whole area had been used as a quarry for centuries, so perhaps it isn't surprising someone got there first, really.
Ooh.
Yeah, in fact, according to the brochure about the King's Grave from the museum that's on the site, those who found the actual grave chamber in 1748 were actually charged for looting it, but then released due to a lack of evidence.
Yeah, maybe if they'd gone round to their house, it was full of Bronze Age sort of statues and bodies and a skeleton in the corner. It was like, that's just the king. Don't mind him.
Olaf, it's the 1750s. Why have you got all this Bronze Age stuff sitting around your farm?
I don't know, but maybe I trust whoever was investigating them back in the 1750s.
The entire complex is circular, about 75 meters in diameter, which is big, and it's actually the largest in Sweden. There are 2 chambers inside, a main chamber and a smaller one that's known as the Prince's Chamber. Inside the main chamber, there are 10 stones which mark the edge of the grave area. And these stones are about 1 meter high and 1 meter wide.
Yeah, and these stones have lots of pictures of them, markings and carvings, which depict cloaked figures, horses and carts, dancers and musicians, and Orsa's looked quite a lot into this.
Yeah, I did, and maybe because I'm ashamed that I've not been. About the carvings on the stones, in the King's Grave in particular, there are actually only paintings on 8 of the 10 stones marking the edge. And also I read that there was originally an 11th stone, but again, someone nicked it in the 1790s.
It's probably the sons or the grandsons of those original farmers.
Who in the late 1700s were just nicking stuff from this place?
But they just wanted 1 stone, so yeah, oh well.
The oldest finds in the grave are actually from the Mesolithic period. They include a Mesolithic tomb with a small stone axe and a flint leaf. Archaeologists have also found stone tools and weapons, and importantly, a small human bone that dates from around 5000 to 4500 BCE. And that leads on to the Bronze Age period, where the stone coffin itself is from around 1400 BCE. And it contains fragments of probably 6 different individuals, 5 of whom were only teenagers when they died. So this goes to show that the King's Grave isn't just one find from one time period, even if it's most famous as a Bronze Age site. It's actually several finds from different periods. And not just those inside the grave, but also outside, where even more remains have been found, indicating that this was used as a burial site throughout the Stone, Iron, and Viking Age. So over a period of 7,000 years. And this is my last point, and then I'm going to stop rambling about the King's Grave. Sorry. If you then take into account a nearby hill called Ingakilsen, there are a further 130 tombs found. So this area is one of the richest Bronze Age burial sites in all of Scandinavia.
And yeah, and that's a lot in just one area. And I bet you haven't even been to the hill.
No.
No. But unlike Orsa, if you do want to visit the King's Grave, it's open to the public every summer. And it's featured in a lot of sort of TV documentaries and stuff in Sweden. It's very famous. But now we say this so often it does become a bit of a cliche, but one of the key things to remember is that these graves wouldn't be typical of the day-to-day person back in the Bronze Age or the Stone Age or any age, really. We mentioned briefly last week that most of the tools and the day-to-day work would have still been done using stone, and average families certainly wouldn't have had the time to go and make one of these gigantic tombs, unfortunately.
Oh, absolutely. This is also reflected in Bronze Age finds where a lot don't contain any bronze at all. I'll quote an article from someone who's quickly becoming everyone's favorite, Professor Johan Ling. So, Professor Ling says, quote, "It is noteworthy that excavations of Bronze Age graves in Bohuslän have uncovered just a few cases of graves equipped with bronze items, gold or elaborate stone. The pattern is even clearer in the Gothenburg area, where about 20 cairns and 20 stone settings have been investigated and dated to the Bronze Age. Only about 10% of those burials had prestige goods such as bronze items or gold.
So you can see from that the bronze itself was hand-picked and used by those elite workers we talked about last week, or held onto by the chieftains or petty kings or family leaders, and certainly not by your day-to-day Swede, which is a shame, as they certainly look nice, but I bet the chieftains didn't want to share their stuff either, so yeah, it makes sense.
Nah. Well, let's move on to our second topic for today, the huge collection of painted stones and inscriptions found all over Sweden and Scandinavia from this time. These are sometimes known as petroglyphs, but we might just call them rock paintings or rock carvings for simplicity.
These are probably the most studied aspect of the Bronze Age in Sweden. There are countless of academic articles written almost every year, it seems, on these stuff, but that's good for us, for stuff to read about.
But also, perhaps for a good reason, Europe's largest concentration of prehistoric rock art is to be found in Sweden, in Bohuslän, on the west coast, to be precise, where there are about 1,500 recorded sites. Today, most of the rock art is located around 10 kilometers inland due to various sort of geographical and geological changes over the millennia, but they would have been closer to the coast when they were made.
Yeah, at least some of them. And the first thing to note about these carvings is that the most common image is a ship. So hence the being near the coastline or at the coastline. And again, Bohuslän is really hitting it out of the park here, because it's known to contain some 10,000 ship images spread over these 1,500 sites. So that's nearly, well, it's probably like 7.5 each per site, I guess.
Olaf, what should we draw today?
Or ship.
Oh, again, we drew 4 ships last week.
Well, I like ship. That's probably what he said. But back down in Skåne, there's also hundreds of axes carved as well. And in general, the rock art of the Bronze Age is different from the Mesolithic picture stones, because the Mesolithic carvers only used to depict animals. They didn't graduate to stickmen. So by the time we get to the Bronze Age, the images they seem to like the most were ships, circles and wheels, men with weapons, men with large penises, ploughs, footprints, and occasionally women, if they were lucky enough to be included.
Now, the purposes and reasons behind these images are much debated, hence all the scholarly articles. They may be secular images, just depicting everyday life, farming, hunting, maritime trade, or they might be sacred, as they include sort of classic religious motifs, including the sun and ships, and what might have been gods of the hunt or fertility, or indeed it's a mix of both.
And there is much evidence that has led many people to argue that these actually were a part of complex religious beliefs. The burial practices themselves, and especially the grave goods for the afterlife that were included, so we're talking weapons, clothing, food and drink, etc., all indicate a belief in the afterlife. So if you take into account these, along with the other offerings, including picture stones, bronze sun wheels, these amazing sort of carved wheel things made out of bronze, and even small metal statues of men and women at places that appear to be places of worship, that all adds to this picture too. And so some of you might be asking how the rock art was actually made, or what it even looked like.
Yeah.
And you can just Google, but that's cheating. So we'll describe it for you. The rock art was made by chiseling them out using a harder rock to bash out a softer rock.
Bash, bash, bash.
Yep, and you would carve out a shape, so just a circle first maybe, taking literally hours to bash out a shape that was deep enough for you to then mix together an ochre material, which was then put into the carvings to make them shine red. And it was so successful that the red lines and the shapes are still very much with us today. And a lot of them were actually also made using a whiter material to make the lines show up white. So you've got these, it's kind of like graffiti or cave art.
Yeah.
And it's just, you bash out your little shape and then you fill in the shape with either a red or a white sort of paint.
Alright, so now that we know how to make rock art, that made me sound like Blue Peter.
Yeah.
Now that we know how to make rock art.
Here's
for
one I made earlier.
reference, Blue Peter is a children's TV program here in the UK where you sort of learn a lot about arts and craft and stuff. So now we've learned how to make rock art. Perhaps a sensible way to split this section going forward is splitting the carvings and painted stones into a section about boats imagery and a section about non-boat imagery.
Yeah, that makes sense because there are lots of boats. So
Yes.
should we start with boats?
Yes, there are many, many boats, or should we say ships, in Swedish rock painting. Like we said, especially along the west coast, as for example, the rock paintings in Tanum, which is a 45 square kilometer area in the county of Bohuslän, where a great number of rock paintings have been found. In fact, it's on the UNESCO World Heritage Site
List.
list. It
Yeah.
is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is what I meant to say.
Cool. That's interesting. There might be a simple reason why boats are such a popular feature of Scandinavian rock art. It's close to the sea, as in Scandinavia is.
Yeah.
And most of the sites where rock paintings are found are either on the coast or near a lake or some other water body. And we saw in the last episode how seafaring and trade was basically fundamental and the touchstone to life in Bronze Age Sweden. So it's not surprising at all that boats played a big part in people's artistic lives as well.
Yeah.
But it can sometimes be difficult to interpret what the boats meant, since they appear in many different settings, sometimes with people jumping off them or getting in them or fighting next to them. And were they a direct focus of the painting, or were they more in the background?
Yeah.
And similarly, boats appear both in what people think are religious and secular motifs. And there are so many varieties of boats as well. There are big ones, small ones, long ones, tall ones, short ones. It's all with different decoration styles as well. And they've all been catalogued and put in a little checkbook thing. But even though there's so much of it, that hasn't stopped people trying to interpret them. So one interpretation I particularly like is by a guy called Christian Christensen, who talks about boats and their relationship to chieftains or like wealthy people in the area. Very quickly, the quote is going to talk about a place called Limfjorden in Norway. So, long maritime voyages between Limfjorden and Bohuslän were part of the normal activities of a chief, and we consequently get some idea of the significance of the ship carvings. The ship was carved at the onset of a long voyage or on reaching a destination. On returning home with new foreign goods, they were probably carved too. The rocks displayed the chief's achievements, but these were also the place where rituals were carried out to ensure safe and successful voyages. End quote.
So it's a bit like a captain's log,
Yep.
combined also with bragging rights for a chief, mixed with some religious stuff. I mean, that seems plausible to me.
Yep. So here we go. Captain's log. 800 BCE. I've just reached Bohuslän. I've encountered some strange bronze people. I'm sending an away team to find out.
Was all that carved into a rock?
Yeah.
That's what.
It was a
what.
elongated Star Trek reference. But so, yeah, the boats were references to all this trade and travel, but they could also be used as, bragging rights for the local chieftains or evidence of successful trips and things like that.
I want to move on to non-boat imagery and touch upon something else that there is a lot of in Swedish rock paintings from the time, and that is penises.
Yeah, or phallic imagery, as it's known in the academic literature.
Yeah, but I prefer to just say penises.
Yeah,
Call a spade, so to speak.
cool.
I've read Lynn Bevan's chapter on hypermasculinity and the construction of gender in the 2015 book Picturing the Bronze Age. And if you're interested in this, she's done a lot of work on gender imagery in rock paintings. So check her work out. The main thing I took away from this was how common sex scenes are in Swedish rock paintings.
Wow.
So, long before Swedish sin became a concept and we became famous for all the nude scenes in our films, our rock paintings were dirty as well.
Wow.
So the erect penis is a frequent symbol in rock paintings. They are seen in all kinds of settings and seem to signify masculinity in everything from warfare to hunting or ploughing, or indeed religious rituals. In fact, we mentioned lots of boats previously. When they are depicted in warrior settings, they often include these erect penises next to the boat as well.
Attached to a human.
Yeah, sorry, and they're not sort of free floating penises. They are attached to stick men in the rock paintings. There are theories that suggest that the use of the penis was to symbolize masculinity in general. In scenes that depict hostage takings, the capturer has a large erect penis, but the captured has not. So perhaps that is indicative of status between the two.
Yeah, or a victory sort of thing. Yeah, and when you're looking at all these rock paintings, it can be quite funny with all these rock paintings of essentially stick figures with almost a third leg. But there is a female equivalent, rock paintings, where a person has a little circle or a cup between their legs, and there also seems to be non-gendered ones, so to speak, which they're just essentially normal stick figures without any attachments. So
yeah, and we should also mention that the penis isn't the only, so to say, exaggerated attribute on these rock paintings. It was, for example, also common to paint the figures with very large calf muscles.
interesting.
They did a lot of time at the gym. Every day in the gym was leg day
Yeah.
for the Bronze Age stick figures.
Yeah, I'm sure they loved it. But to move briefly or permanently away from the penises, there are some other common motifs.
Okay, so it's not just rocks filled with boats and penises.
No, fortunately for us. There are actually lots of violence-related scenes as well that don't just involve penises and boats. And you mentioned in before the scenes of hostages and other forms of violence. In terms of humans depicted in the rock art, many are warriors with weapons and armor. They're actually that detailed. It's quite impressive. And these people hold axes, bows and arrows, spears, shields, but the most common is definitely just a regular sword. And an archaeologist, Mats Malmer, has counted that 40% of the human figures in Bohuslän carry swords.
Wow.
So that's quite the army of swordsmen that
Yeah.
they took a long time to make. There's even a cooler scene, I guess you could say, which Andreas Toreld has discovered. On a surface of rock that was 16 metres by 5 metres in size, in someone's private garden, they discovered a scene with a human figure thrusting a spear with both hands into the chest of an enemy. So
Wow.
that's very cool. And apparently it's unique for Northern Europe, the first and only so far murder with a spear.
Wow, go Sweden.
Yeah, famous for something else. And Andreas goes on to talk about how, and I'll quote, skeletal trauma shows that a common cause of death among those who were killed during the Bronze Age in Northern Europe was being struck by a spear. The victims have been found in ordinary graves as well as in mass graves in which entire families appear to have been murdered.
Wow.
End quote. Yeah.
That is grim.
That is pretty grim, but evidence that the stones weren't just something of a religious context or a hypothetical situation. They were actually a depiction of everyday murdering life and maybe the gloat or boast of the people who made them. But like most things, it's important to not get too excited. It can be possible to count some of the long sticks or just random shapes on these rock paintings as swords. Just because they're holding something doesn't necessarily mean it is a sword. And so it's one of the things the researchers are quite key to point out when you're talking about these things is tends to help if it has a pommel or a guard on the shield. If it doesn't have that sort of extra bit than a stick, then it might actually just be a stick. So
as Freud would say, sometimes a stick is just a stick.
yeah, exactly.
That's a reference that doesn't necessarily work. We've talked about trade and interconnectedness during this period, so we talked about that in the last episode, and it's interesting to see how rock paintings found in Sweden sometimes share similarities with those found elsewhere in Europe. For example, in northern Italy, even if some of the Swedish finds are more unique, like the spear death thing, there's still a level of connectedness.
When you combine the boats with some of the nearby non-boat images, you can start to create a realistic depiction of what was happening at the time. And going back to Christian Christensen, he said that during the latter part of the Bronze Age, there appears to be these two warrior chieftains from the southeast coast of Sweden that had made good relations with chiefs in Central Europe. And it was beginning of a widespread exchange of goods and knowledge that would make this area sort of a key departure point for some of these trips. And you can see that in the carvings where the axes that the two chiefs were carrying in the pictures were the same type of axe that was from Austria and Hungary at the time. So it's sort of showing how their trips, like, they wouldn't have done this type of axe in the painting unless they had actually gone there and said, hey, they've got weird axes, let's take some and then draw them later when we get home.
You needed to have seen them. So that connecting the boats to the axes and trade and...
Yeah, so it's all about... that's just one example. And one written example which neatly sums up the experience and the use of ships in trade is that from the epic oral poem that is the Odyssey, attributed to Homer, which was set in the Bronze Age of sea voyages and all this great trade. So I had to read this both before and at university. So there's a bit where Menelaus tells Telemachus in Book 4 that when it comes to men, I feel that few or none can rival me in wealth, for it took me 7 years and great hardship to amass this fortune and bring it home in my ships. My travels took me to Cyprus, to Phoenicia, and to Egypt. Ethiopians, Sidonians, Arembrians, I visited them all, and I saw Libya too, he said.
Well, your voice when you read the Odyssey is even better than when you speak Danish.
Yeah, thank you. But it's an epic oral poem. It's supposed to be performed.
But it wasn't a criticism.
No. So this just adds it's all building this huge picture of really is part of this huge network of all these countries and regions and trading styles, and everything's all coming in together. And the rock art is just one small piece of evidence of this happening in the Swedish context, even though Menelaus didn't bother coming up to Sweden or mention it in his little speech.
But before we wrap up for this week, there are two final points to perhaps mention about the rock paintings. There are also indications that some site of Bronze Age rock paintings might have been used again in the early Iron Age. Less so in Sweden to compare to elsewhere in Europe. There was more reuse in the rest of Europe.
Yeah, and sometimes they're reused later in the Bronze Age. I remember in one article there was something saying how there was a man with an axe who later on they've added in a spearman behind him stabbing him in the back, but they can tell that it was carved at a later date. So you can always add on extra bits to rock art. So you've got to be careful in some of that interpretation.
The other important thing to remember when talking about rock paintings and how to interpret them and what they mean is that we have no Rosetta Stone. We've got no key for what they mean or how to read them like we do with Egyptian hieroglyphs.
Yeah, there's no user's guide, basically.
No, there's no guide to that piece of flat pack furniture. No. I'm not discrediting the scholarly literature or research on the topic. On the contrary, but we are interpreting these paintings in the end without a fact sheet to correct us.
Yeah, but you can, adding all these different bits and pieces and all the physical evidence that adds to the trade does give you this bigger picture that we think does make sense. And certainly, I think what we've been talking about does make sense.
Definitely.
But nonetheless, they are fascinating and they're remnants of this period that goes quite far back in time. So it's good to have a tangible connection to the people who lived thousands of years ago.
So with that, it's perhaps time to, wrap up this week's episode. And we've reached the end of the Bronze Age in Sweden. And next time we'll be moving into the Iron Age.
Yep, bye-bye, Bronze Age. See you next time.
Yeah, I don't know. What's coolest, bronze or iron, in terms of metals?
I don't know. I'm going to maybe disappoint you in the sense that the Iron Age seems less interesting until you get to the Vikings. So I think the Bronze Age is going to be more fun from the bit of research I've done already so far.
But
that doesn't mean don't listen to the Iron Age episode.
No, because I think we need to look into why there is less sort of traces from Iron Age Sweden than both the periods before and after. The Iron Age is a bit of a mystery.
Yep, but just so very briefly, we've talked about more graves again, and the King's Grave especially, so we're going to put that on our list for something to go and see when we're next back in Sweden.
Yeah.
And we talked about all the boats and the rock art and all that kind of stuff. And, penises, and how it all added into this picture of Bronze Age trade and how Sweden was getting all its ideas and bronze and all the artifacts from all around this Bronze Age network.
So until next time, follow us on social media. We're on Twitter.
Yep, at Flatpack Sweden. And we're on email at flatpackhistorysweden@gmail.com.
Yeah, and we're on Facebook.
Yeah, just search for Flatpack History Sweden. And yeah, we'll love to speak to you or send you a message, all that sort of thing.
Always great when you guys get in touch. So until next time, stay safe, take care.
And we'll see you then.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Hej då!